I saw the doctor this week and he said, 1 more month. He's just very, very conservative. And so, a few more weeks. The lesson this morning is all Jeff's fault. We studied, as he mentioned, the story about I call him the obstinate demon that did not want to come out. And Jesus made a statement. In the book of Mark, it said, this kind comes out only by prayer. I think the battery died, Jeff. We're in trouble. And I didn't bring another computer, so well,
this one won't reach over there, will it?
Okay. Plug it in over there.
Okay.
We'll see how this works. Then I'll move my chair in just a minute. That was over in the book of Mark. He said, this kind comes out only by prayer. But then you turn over to the book of Matthew that records the same story. And it says that Jesus said, this kind comes out only by prayer and fasting. But at the beginning of that particular verse is a little number. And it says, see a footnote. And down at the footnote of your Bible, it's going to say this verse in Matthew does not appear in most of the older manuscripts. And so we have this whole section. And the reason it's Jeff's fault is because he just ignored the whole statement about and fasting. And yet, I've had questions on that over and over and over again. So we're going to talk about fasting. And if you didn't pick one up on the way in, if you're so disposed, I put my outline for all of these scriptures and the points that I'm going to make, printed it out, and it's on the table in the foyer. And you can pick one up. So you don't have to take notes this morning. If we get this up on the PowerPoint, we're going to have to get a different battery for that. Fasting. Fasting is one of the most interesting things that people do, because you do it by not doing. And I've often thought about that. That if you're actually not doing, you're going to do something. And the not doing of this allows for you to do something. It makes way. It makes room in your life to do something. And it's no accident that in the New Testament it got aligned with the idea that it was prayer and fasting. So, are we there yet? Pretty close. In the Old Testament, and I just made a list of these, we're not going to talk about it. I just want you to see the consistency of what actually gets said on this. Now, Jeff, I just realized, if you ever go try to watch the video of this, I'm going to be a talking head. The interesting thing is I'm probably about as tall as if I stood up. But in the Old Testament, when you look for idea being having a fast, it was never commanded. The only thing that was commanded was over in the book of Leviticus on the Day of Atonement. Now, the Day of Atonement was one of the busiest religious days in all of the Old Testament, because they sacrificed and sacrificed and sacrificed and sacrificed. And if you go make a list of how many animals got sacrificed on that day, It was the busiest day of the year. And so, as we begin looking at what it does, we can also look at what took place. And that is, all it said was, humble yourself. What does that mean? And so the Jews tried to figure out, what does that mean? And this is what they came up with. It means to fast. And the word fast is an interesting word. The Greeks always liked to do this. They would take one word and then they would add a negative on the front of that. And the word that they chose was eating. And the word eating meant eating and drinking. It included everything that you would do when you had a complete meal. And they put a negative on that from that. Don't eat. And so we used a different word, and we talk about fasting. I think it would have been interesting, just think about this for a minute, if the translators would have just translated that literally. Don't eat. That would change how we read so many of these scriptures. But they chose the idea of fasting, and it was called that in the New Testament when Paul was sailing to Rome. They sailed right at the break of wintertime, and that was a dangerous time because that was after the fast. And if you read that, what that means is that was after the Day of Atonement. And the Day of Atonement came about October, and so anytime after October, sailing on the Mediterranean Sea was precarious because of the winter storms that was there. But that's the only time that we call this the fast. And you begin then going through. And as the Jews became in a situation of calamity, when the enemies were going to war with them, in the book of Judges twice, what it said was they declared a fast where everybody simply did not eat for a period of time. How long? We have no idea. How much? That is, did they just not eat meat? Did they not eat food but drank water? Did they completely not eat anything or drink anything at all? And the answer is, we have no instructions or indications on exactly what they did. We just know that there was something that they didn't do. They didn't eat. When David's boy from Bathsheba was sick, David fasted. I'm going to tell you, I think this is as close as most Christians get to really fasting. Because if you've ever had a child that was at the brink of death in the hospital, people would have spent time, guilty as charged, I tried to do this. I've noticed they're not eating. And so you try to grab them and usher them down to the cafeteria so that you can eat. And if you can get them to go, they'll order something and then they sit at the table and they look at you. They're not interested in eating. They're not thinking about the Super Bowl. They're not thinking about anything except, I want to get back up to that room and be near my child. And if they are left alone in that room, I almost guarantee you what they were doing. They were praying. And they would have prayed. The closest that they probably ever came to praying all night in their life would be at such time. And so they forego eating in order to pray. After someone has died, again the same thing. I've had to almost try to force people to come and eat something because of the grief. And what they're doing is they're praying to God because of this. When they have sinned and known that they were cut off from God and that they were in danger of being cast out of the presence of God forever. If you have any feelings at all about God and eternity, I'm going to tell you what you're going to do at that point in time. You're not going to go eat. You're going to pray. You're going to cry continually unto the Lord. And when they needed protection during times of war, they were outnumbered so many times. And what they did was they prayed. And as they looked out and saw the enemy, nobody thought about eating. You're thinking about the enemy and what's going to happen at that time. And so it was a time of fasting. They abstained from eating on that. And the New Testament is like that. The widow that decided to give her whole life, and she served in the temple so much so that she went without eating. Now, you all know that that can't last for very long. There has to come a time when you have to have some sustenance. But on the whole, she would rather be in the temple and praying to God than going out and eating. Now, one of the things that I thought about when I thought about this, and I thought about this for 40 years. Don't know that I'm any smarter than I was when I started, because there's not a lot of material. But I got thinking about it. What did it take to get a meal in the first century? Now, I go to Jack in the Box, Sonic. Now, if it's really big, you go to one of the fancier restaurants where they seat you and give you a napkin, and it takes a little bit longer, but I can get a meal in a matter of minutes. In the first century, when you wanted to get a meal, you remember back in the book of Genesis when the strangers came to see Abraham, and Abraham said, "Let's have a meal." And one of the servants had to go find one of the sheep and slaughter the sheep and butcher the sheep, start the fire, and cook the sheep and whatever else they were going to have. And so that took a lot of time. And so when you think about fasting throughout the Old Testament, the foregoing of food, you're also including in that the preparation that would allow you to eat in the first place. And so it was not a simple thing. It was a very complex thing to eat and prepare a meal. And in these times of war and times of grief and times of anxiety over your loved ones, you did not want to take all of that time to prepare. And so they simply did not eat. Jesus fasted for 40 days. He was baptized and God said, "This is my beloved Son." And then it said that the Spirit took him out into the wilderness to be tempted. And while he was out there being tempted for 40 days, he didn't eat. Okay? Time out again. How would he have prepared something to eat out in the wilderness? How much time and energy and thought would have gone to take place? Now there's another option there. The angels that ministered unto him may have just brought him the food. But what it says was, he fasted for 40 days. And the Pharisees and the disciples of John, it says that they fasted. We don't know how long, when, how much, what food they didn't do. The Pharisee that Jesus picked on over in Luke chapter 18, when he prayed to God, he prayed, "I fast twice a week," as if that was an accomplishment. And in some sense, I guess it may have been. Cornelius, when he was trying to figure out how to be right with God, he was fasting when the angel appeared unto him and gave him the scene. Paul, after he had seen the Lord on the way to Damascus and realized he was completely on the wrong side of history, literally so, and now he's Jesus is real. Jesus was raised from the dead. I've seen him. He's talked to me. And Paul had no desire to eat. He spent those 3 days and nights praying unto God. Again, Paul lists hardship. And you read that list over in 2 Corinthians, and I'm going to tell you what, I have not had one hardship day in my life as a Christian compared with what Paul was going through. But what did Paul do when he was facing death, facing the opponents that were trying to kill him? He didn't eat. That was the last thing on his mind, the last thing that he's thinking about. And then in that boat, in the storm out on the sea, thinking they were all going to die, what would you have done if you were on that boat? And I know what they did. They didn't eat. Now, that's one of those positive negatives. That's what they did. They fasted. But in fasting, it means they didn't eat. And so that left them the opportunity that they can call out to God. They could pray to God. And whichever God they may have been serving, because these were not all Christians on that boat. But they were all in danger. And they all had the same emotional response that they weren't interested. So, my conclusion, I don't think it was a religious exercise that was prescribed by God. There was something going on in their life, and they chose to do this rather than eat. And the choosing of this is what God put the emphasis upon. And when God gives us a choice of things to do, and God says, but this is what I prefer, my thinking is, I want to prefer what God prefers. I want to put priority where God puts the priority on that. And in those times that we just read about, it just wasn't about eating. It was hard to provide food. I looked this up. They first learned how to can food so that they would have it for the wintertime in the 1800s. The refrigerator. The first patent for the idea was 1849, and the first real refrigerator that they could make, we were well into the 1900s. They didn't have refrigerators, and they didn't have 7-Eleven. They would have died to have an H-E-B. Prepared food already, but they didn't have it. So, on times of calamity, they chose something else. They chose to be active, but not in the process of eating. Now, that then got commemorated and turned into a religious exercise. So, for example, you read back in the book of Jeremiah, and on the 10th day of the 5th month, they celebrated. That's negative. They commemorated the fact that they had been so sinful that God allowed Jerusalem, the holy city, to be utterly destroyed, along with thousands and thousands of their people. And so they set aside that day, and they fasted on that day as a sign of sorrow. They did the same thing in the second day of the 7th month, because one of God's messengers, Gedaliah, was put to death. And so they set aside and they celebrated by declaring a fast on that day. The 10th day of the 10th month, because the siege of Jerusalem started, they had a fast. The 9th day of the 4th month. You all see something happening here? If they had been serving God, none of that would have happened. If they had put God first in their life and been following His teachings, none of that would have happened. And so it's kind of surprising that they're here celebrating all of this. Now, the prophet Isaiah saw this same thing. And so he quoted them in chapter 58 of Isaiah. The people said, the quote, "Why have we fasted and you do not see?" Did God take note of their fasting? Well, we know God knew what they were doing, but God didn't respond. And so they want to know, we're fasting, and you're not responding to this. We've humbled ourselves, and you did not notice. And now, I wish they could have done this, because starting in verse 4, it's God's response. And God answers them, why didn't I pay attention to the fasting? He said, behold, on the day of your fast, you find desire. You drive hard all of your workers. You fast for contention and strife, to strike with a wicked fist. You do not fast like you do today, to make your voice heard on high. Is it a fast like this which I choose? A day for a man to humble himself? Is it for bowing one's head like a reed, for spreading out sackcloth and ashes? Will you call this a fast, even an acceptable day to the Lord? That what they should have done is, God says, now pay attention, is not this the fast that I would choose? To loosen the bonds of wickedness, to undo the bands of a yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break the yoke. Which is more important? You choosing to go a day without food, or you treating your servants right? Which is more important? You choosing to go half a day without food, or let your servants go free? And the answer is, where God put the emphasis was not on choosing a day not to eat, but upon choosing to do what God had asked you to do. To change your character, to be what you want to. And so the Pharisee, I fast twice a week, he made it a religious exercise, but he was not godly. Jesus used him because he was an example of one that was religious, but not godly. And fasting falls into that so oftentimes. And then Jesus said, as Ken read for us, on the Sermon on the Mount. Now, the Sermon on the Mount was primarily, first of all, delivered to the Jewish people. And they knew what was going on. And they saw the Pharisees fasting. And they saw the Pharisees blowing a trumpet before them as they went to the street corner so that they could pray out loud and be seen of men. And Jesus talked about that. He says, whenever you fast, do not put on a gloomy face, as the hypocrites do. For they neglect the appearance so that they will be noticed by men when they are fasting. Were they fasting to be heard of God? Were they fasting because they were actually upset about their sin or their relationship with God? And the answer is no. And so fasting became a religious exercise to them. And I always love this. Jesus said, they have their reward. They got what they wanted out of that. So when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face so that fasting will not be noticed by men, but by your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. But again, do you all notice? We have no instructions on fasting. We don't know when that is supposed to take place. Is it 40 days? I hope not. Does it mean to completely go without food or just not eat desserts? And you see, the word itself doesn't tell you. It just means not to eat. And so, when Jesus was baptized, God said, this is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. And immediately the Spirit impelled him to go into the wilderness, and he was there for 40 days to be tempted of Satan. And he was with the wild beast, and the angels were ministering unto him. And then Matthew points out that after he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, what do you think happened? He was hungry. It's a little bit of an understatement. I just put an exclamation point in the margin of my Bible. Imagine that. And he was hungry. Now, what would he have done to provide food? And that's what we've already discussed. That would have been a major enterprise out here in the wilderness. Having to leave the wilderness or go somewhere. Or with Jesus later, he could have simply made food. He did on 2 occasions. But he didn't. What was he doing? Have you ever asked yourself that question? What was Jesus doing as he was being tempted by the devil? What was he thinking about? What was on his priority? And I'm going to tell you what was not on his priority. Eating. Was he hungry? Yeah, it says so. But have you ever had something more important than food on your list? Have you ever been in the hospital with a sick child? And the last thing you're thinking about is eating? Now, John's disciples and the Pharisees, they were fasting, and they came and they asked Jesus, why do we fast, but your disciples don't fast? This is interesting. As the disciples were with Jesus, they weren't fasting. The Son of God in their presence, and they weren't fasting. So Jesus said to them, here's the reason. Now, y'all going to have to think about this. And that's the way Jesus teaches in parables. He doesn't tell you the lesson. He gives you an illustration, and you have to go figure it out. And it can be figured out. He said, while the bridegroom is with them, the attendants of the bridegroom don't fast. So long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. Why? That's not what they're thinking about. They're thinking about the ceremony, the marriage, the festivity that goes with that. And in the Jewish days, sometimes the marriage thing went on for 3, 4, 5 weeks at a time. And the father of the bride was supposed to provide all that food. Aren't you all glad we changed that? But the bridegroom, they're busy taking care of things, not thinking about eating. And what is the point of that? And the point is that in religious activities, the action is only appropriate for the appropriate occasion. And when we think about setting aside a day when I'm not going to eat, what's the purpose of that? What do you hope to accomplish by that? What is the reason that I would... And we oftentimes forget that. And so a lot of people fast in order to fast. And then we go back and we try to figure out what good does it do? Now, I'm going to tell you, it's not a secret. About 4 months ago, I decided I was going to fast on Mondays and Fridays. And so I got up and I ate a little breakfast, and then I waited until Saturday to eat the next meal. Because I knew what was going to happen. And I lost 30 pounds. Now, my purpose for fasting on those things was not a religious purpose. I just understood the reason why I was doing that. But on a religious basis, what is the purpose? And I come to a conclusion. Now, let me continue this. 2 times in the rest of the New Testament, it specifically talks about them fasting. In Acts chapter 13, when they were going to appoint elders in the church, they fasted and prayed before they appointed elders. This was a big decision. And so, the fasting allowed them to pray. The fasting allowed them to pray without ceasing, to be involved in this in depth. In Acts chapter 14, they appointed elders in every church. And again, they did the same thing. It says they prayed and they fasted. So the not eating allowed for the activity. And the activity was not eating. The activity was praying. And so it allowed them to do that. In Mark chapter 9, the same thing. And this is what Jesus said about the obstinate spirit. This obstinate spirit was different than all the other spirits. Jeff did bring this out Wednesday night. If you missed it, it was a good Bible class. You ought to be there. But what Jeff said was, and pointed out, that when you read the book of Mark, the demons that appear in chapter 1 and chapter 3,
They recognized who Jesus was immediately and acknowledged that. You are the Son of God. Have you come to torment us before the time? This one didn't do that. And when Jesus cast him out, yeah, he came out. Right after he displayed his power and authority over this young man's body, and a grand mal seizure, in effect, took place. And then he came out. And the apostles wanted to know, why couldn't we cast this one out? And Jesus said, this kind, and that, I'm going to tell you what, I thought about that for 40 years. What other kinds are there? How many kinds are there that we don't have any indication of? And I'm going to tell you what, it doesn't matter what kind they are. They're all subject unto Jesus, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And when he says this, they came out. So, there's not a command in the New Testament. There's only some examples. What did the examples show us? And the examples show us that they chose, rather than spending the time preparing, and eating, they chose that time to be of service unto God. Most of the time, in very active praying. There's no instructions on how to do it. That is, outside of, if you're going to do it in secret. Comb your hair and put on your clothes and go about your business. The other one, Mark chapter 2, he talks about you do it when it's appropriate. It's not just an exercise. But when's it appropriate? There's no instruction. How long am I supposed to fast? There's no instructions. How restrictive? There's not even an example that I can go to try to find out what was that all about. But what I do see is it was connected time and time and time and time again with simply connecting with God, using that time to communicate, to pray, to think, to reflect about God and my relationship. The not eating doesn't draw you closer to God. The not eating allows you to do things that will draw you closer to God. And because of that, when it's coupled with fervent prayer and not taking the rest of the time, it will draw you into the very presence of God. I feel the times when I have been in a hospital with people and we have prayed and we have been more concerned, we've drawn closer to God in our spirit. Now that's just a subjective idea, but that is the way that it appears and feels. So here's what I'm going to suggest to you. Get busy. Get busy to the point that you don't have time to eat. And if you don't have time to eat, be busy. And you don't have to talk about it. You don't have to think about it. You don't even have to take the time to go through Wiener Schnitzel drive-thru. You're busy serving the Lord. And I'm going to tell you, that's what we need. We need, all of us, as we've been singing in the Psalms, to draw nearer to God and actively be involved in serving God. The idea of being a disciple. And we talked about this in our Bible class this morning. And it has to do with the Great Commission. Jesus said, all authority has been given to me in heaven and upon earth. Go ye therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. And Jeff made a point of saying, too oftentimes, that's when we quit. We accomplished what we were after. And the answer is no, we didn't. Because the next thing it is, teach them to observe all things whatsoever I've commanded. I don't know whether you've ever done this or not, but I'm going to suggest it. Get you a notebook and start at Matthew chapter 1 And every time you see that there is a commandment, a statement, a declaration on what I, as a disciple, ought to do, write that down in your notebook. And keep reading. And you're going to fill page after page after page. And there are things to keep us busy. And I know you have to eat. And I'm going to have to quit here so that I can let you go eat. But my point about it is, we need to be busy. We eat because we have to eat. But we're busy for the Lord because we love the Lord with all of our heart and all of our soul and all of our mind. Are you busy? Are you keeping? Are you serving? This is the goal of discipleship. And eating, you can take it or leave it. You can decide to do it or not do it. But when you decide not to do it, I'm going to ask you one question. Why did you decide that? What was the purpose, the goal? What are you going to create in that space that you've now opened up in your life? And my suggestion is this: serve God. If you're willing to do that, first of all, become a disciple, believing in Jesus and being baptized for the remission of your sin, and then arise to serve the Lord every day of your life to the best of your ability. If you're willing to do that, we invite you to come as together we stand and sing